So when we think about North Korea today, our minds almost immediately jump to, geopolitics, nuclear tensions, or those images of totalitarian leaders. But in today's explainer, we're going to dive into Suzy Kim's absolutely fascinating historical analysis, Everyday Life in the North Korean Revolution. And let me tell you, it completely shatters those modern assumptions. We are going to travel back to a very brief, incredibly specific window in time. We're talking 1945 to 1950, right between the liberation from Japanese colonial rule and the outbreak of the Korean War. We'll be looking at the daily, on-the-ground lives of everyday people, the peasants, the women, the youth, and we'll see how they literally built a social revolution from the ground up.
Here is our roadmap for unpacking this complex history today. We've got 1. Beyond the Dark Satellite. 2. Revolution in the Everyday. 3. Three Pillars of Reform. 4. Enacting the Collective. 5. The Revolutionary Mother. And finally, 6. Memory and Silenced Voices. Let's get right into it.
All right, part 1. Beyond the Dark Satellite. Now, listen to this quote from former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld back in 2002. He said, "If you look at a picture from the sky of the Korean peninsula at night, North Korea is dark." It perfectly captures this prevailing modern assumption we all kind of share, right? North Korea as a tragedy of backwardness, a dark satellite completely cut off from the modern world, just sitting in literal darkness while its southern neighbor is glowing with light. And honestly, this idea has become the default lens through which the West views North Korean history, basically as a total, absolute failure of modernity. But here's where Suzy Kim's analysis does a total 180. She pivots completely away from that narrative of darkness. She takes this concept of the everyday and defines it not as something mundane or boring or ordinary, but as an extraordinary site of massive social change. She points out that in the context of early North Korea, suddenly changing your daily habits, your routines, your local spaces, that wasn't just ordinary life. It was a highly conscious, deliberate rejection of capitalist subjugation and colonial hierarchy. It was a distinctly modern move.
Moving right along to Part 2, Revolution in the Everyday.
Okay, imagine this scene. It's August 16th, 1945, the exact moment of liberation. Political prisoners and massive crowds are stepping spontaneously into the public square right after Japan's surrender. There is just absolute euphoria, hands raised in the air, people cheering, the sheer overwhelming relief of a population finally freed from decades of brutal colonial rule. Almost overnight, the streets themselves transformed into this vibrant space of public political action.
But, we really have to acknowledge the psychological whiplash here. Despite the profound joy of liberation, the trauma of colonialism ran deep. The writer Oh Young-jin actually captured this perfectly at the time, writing, "A happy day has come, but for some reason I feel empty, as if there is a gaping hole in one corner." It's incredibly poignant. These people had to figure out how to rebuild an entirely new society on top of some incredibly deep emotional and structural scars left behind by Japanese imperialism.
So they had a monumental choice to make about what kind of society they actually wanted to build. The system they were leaving behind, what the author calls capitalist colonial modernity, was incredibly alienating. It homogenized everyday life for one reason, to extract efficient labor and resources for the Japanese Empire. In stark contrast to that, early North Korea was aiming for a socialist modernity. They wanted the exact opposite. They envisioned an everyday life that was public through and through, where your labor was socially productive and deeply meaningful to the community, rather than just being a cheap commodity to be bought and sold.
Which brings us to Part 3, Three Pillars of Reform.
Now, you might be wondering, how do you actually make this new socialist modernity a reality on the ground? Well, the author identifies 3 foundational reforms that essentially rewired society from the bottom up. First, radical land reform that completely dismantled the ancient entrenched hierarchy of landlords and tenants. Second, mass elections that brought unprecedented political representation directly to the masses. And third, a massive national literacy campaign to bring education into the most remote villages. Together, these 3 pillars allowed ordinary peasants to go from centuries of total submission to suddenly becoming active, literate political participants.
In 1946 was absolutely the pivot year for all of this. That's when the sweeping land reform was officially rolled out, and guys, this wasn't some slow bureaucratic policy transition. The state confiscated land from the wealthy landlords entirely without compensation, and then handed it directly to the tillers for free. Boom! Literally overnight, this radically altered social relations, handing real, tangible power and agency to the poor peasants who, frankly, made up the vast majority of the population.
Let's dive into Part 4, Enacting the Collective. Under this new system, individual happiness was now routed through something called organizational life, or chojeksengwa. In this entirely new framework, collective duty completely replaced the old idea of individual capitalist competition. You simply didn't view yourself as an isolated individual anymore. It was more like being a vital piece of a giant, interconnected puzzle. Through constant local meetings, community study sessions, and shared activities, people were actively enacting the revolution every single day of their lives.
And this collective action was happening everywhere. You had mass organizations springing up. Everything from a children's league gathering kids together to passionate speakers rallying crowds at women's league meetings. Suzy Kim explains that these mass organizations acted as vital transmission belts between the everyday people and the political party. They basically ensured that the revolution wasn't just some top-down mandate coming from a capital city, but a deeply lived, daily practice for literally everyone, no matter their age or gender.
All right, part 5, the revolutionary mother.
This is a fascinating dynamic. Just listen to how Chung Jung-suk framed this cultural shift back in October 1947. We now realize that the master of the home must be the woman, that is, the wife or mother. The traditional domestic space wasn't being destroyed, it was being radically redefined. The revolution sought to make the woman its active master. Yes, women were highly encouraged to step out into the public sphere, to learn to read, to vote, and participate in politics. But incredibly, this new empowerment was often framed specifically through the lens of their traditional domestic roles.
What's super interesting here is how early North Korea uniquely blended deeply rooted tradition with brand new socialism. If you look at the Soviet Union or China during the revolutions, the ideal revolutionary was almost always framed through this lens of masculine brotherhood. The rugged, muscular worker or peasant. But in North Korea, revolutionary motherhood became the highest ideal. The self-sacrificing, nurturing mother became the quintessential symbol of revolutionary sacrifice. And not just for women. It became the absolute model for men to emulate as well. It was this remarkable, localized fusion of old cultural norms and new socialist goals.
And finally, part 6, memory and silenced voices.
Now here is where the story takes a darker turn. Over time, the state heavily centralized its narrative. Suzy Kim details how the incredibly diverse, spontaneous voices of the women and the peasants were systematically silenced. Women's specific complex narratives were pushed to the margins, brushed off as mere women's history, rather than core national history. The messy, beautiful, grassroots agency of local villages was completely ignored. Ultimately, this vibrant, localized revolution was violently flattened. The rich tapestry of the everyday revolution was erased, replaced entirely by a rigid, top-down mythology of one single leader's sole accomplishments, Kim Il-sung.
So, we have to ask ourselves, can recuperating the memory of this specific, vibrant, liberated space offer us alternative possibilities beyond our rigid Cold War binaries? By digging into Kim's analysis and uncovering the actual everyday lives of these forgotten revolutionaries, the peasants, the mothers, the local organizers, we totally challenge the simplistic narrative of a passive population that was just instantly controlled by a totalitarian state from day one. It really begs the question, when we view the world strictly through these modern, black and white stereotypes, what other rich, deeply human histories are we completely missing? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you something to think about.